So my name is Leda Glyptis. I see the future of banking remains quite male-dominated, but hopefully otherwise quite different. So I work with Sapient on the digital transformation side. So what we're about to talk about is what I do for a living. I am a former academic, successful startup exit at a time when that didn't mean very much, and former banker. I seem to have done everything the wrong way around, but it has been a hell of a ride. And what I'm about to talk to you about is a series of observations that go about 20 years back, but need to be thought through and resolved in the next 2 to 5 years. And I'll get to why they need to be thought through and resolved very soon. Now, I've got a couple of slides, a few things to talk about, but I would like to make this interactive. So please jump in, ask questions, tell me I'm making no sense, tell me you agree, disagree, or would like to pause on whatever it is I'm covering. So, how many technologists do I have in the room? And some of you are old enough to remember 10, 15, 20 years ago. Remember what it was like? We were usually in the basement. We were usually in highly contrarian meetings with a business. We knew where we stood with them and they knew where they stood with us, and we didn't like each other, but there was this uncomfortable understanding. I remember sitting in a basement, obviously, 15 years ago, Tier 1 bank, and we have just had one of those meetings with a business where they have stopped short of telling us they hate us, but they need us. And my star engineer says to me with despair in his voice, I just don't like people and things because they're messy, but I like software. Now, I thought, at the time, but totally understood him at the same time. And what we're seeing is a complete and radical transformation of that world. I have been in a bunch of meetings with both technologists and business folks who are a little shocked at the rise of the new geek. The geek has inherited the earth, but it's not that geek. It's not the geek who did not like people and things. It is not the geek that was consigned to the basement 15 years ago, and that geek is actually as uncomfortable as their business counterparts. Why is that? Well, because the new world, and I know we're talking about APIs here today, but we all know the API revolution is part of a wider transformation of toolkits that change the human experience. And whether it's banking or anywhere else, we have tools at our disposal that allow us to reimagine a process, to go back 1 or 10 steps and go, what was this for? And is there a better way of doing it? And we have the technology today to work that magic, and that technology has come fully loaded with a new value system. Profit is understood differently. We're talking about sharing economies. What does that mean, actually, particularly in banking? We're talking about human-centric design. Banks talk about it. God knows what it actually means when you're looking at transaction banking. And we're looking at different forms of exchange. Terms like saturated and interrupted interactions are terms that are being used in banking boardrooms. And I would hazard a guess that nobody actually knows what they mean. So what I would like to do is take a moment to talk about what the rise of the new geek is doing to the banking value chain. I'm not here to talk to you about the technology. There are people better placed than I to do that. And I'm not here to talk about the possibility in terms of specifics, but I am here to talk about the types of change we're seeing. Now, as I said, the ones who are old enough to remember the world before, remember BRDs and super users. Remember super users? I was talking to some IT recruits at a client recently. They had never heard of the word. The idea that you would need to identify someone from the business and spend months teaching them how to use your system was laughable to them. The problem is that the people who are used to super users still make decisions. And they try to make decisions that are good for their business, and they try to make decisions that are good for their organization. But the world as they knew it has changed. The geeks as they knew them have changed. And today they meet this new geek who has a massive impact on their bottom line, who can build an API layer for their legacy infrastructure, who can expose custody positions to their clients through an API, who can do all that and can do it with ease, confidence, and panache. But they don't know how to manage this new geek. They don't know how to behave around this 25-year-old in jeans who now has a massive impact on their bottom line. They don't know how to organize and orchestrate their business around it. And they most definitely don't know how to price this API. So what I want to do is talk about a couple of trends, not in terms of the technology implementation, but in terms of the infrastructure and value chain it is to be integrated in. Now, I am going to talk about things that are my bread and butter, but if they're not yours, that doesn't mean you're missing something. It means I have missed something. So please jump up and say, that makes no sense. I don't know that little corner of banking, right? So 3 trends that I'm seeing in every single client I have spoken to and every single bank I've worked in. And sadly for me, there have been a few of those. So the traditional mentality of banks is actually quite collaborative. Don't hear anyone who says that collaboration doesn't come naturally to banks. It does. They know how to do it. But it is done with 3 fundamental assumptions. 1, we know each other. We know the players. They've been vetted, they've been tested, they're regulated. We speak the same language. 2, if we could grab the entire market, we would. And it is understood and respected, and it's okay. 3, there is one thing that is more fearful and panic-inducing in banking than compressed margins, and that's dependency. Nothing is dreaded more than dependency. So collaboration is bound by those 3 slightly contradictory things that create a very familiar balance. If I could eat your lunch, I would, but then I would probably have a dependency on that guy, and he's someone I know, but really I'm gonna divide and give you some business and give you some business and collaborate with you so that we can create a balance. That's collaboration of sorts. They know how to do that, organizations of all sizes. But what we're looking at as we're moving to API economies is deliberate dependencies. And that is not a concept that sits comfortably with how decisions are made within banks, not because they don't want to share the pie, although they don't want to share the pie, but also because the risk mechanics of the organization are not calibrated to allow for dependency. And we need to take that on board when we're talking to institutions. They have a whole host of stage gates to protect you and your savings and your mortgage and your grandmother's pension from going down the drain. Right or wrong, they're stress tested and the best they have, and those processes bulk at dependency. And we're bringing in technology that encourages people, in fact, forces them, if we go down the PSD2 path, it forces them to build dependency, which means that you have to ask all sorts of questions. How much of what I do is core to my business? And how much is something that I need but won't actually bring value add? Everyone in banking likes to quote Uber. God knows what it is they mean when they quote Uber. I have never understood what it is they're taking away from that example. Disruptive. Sure, but to whom? And fundamentally, where do you as a bank see yourself in this Uber economy? Because the real question that you need to ask is, What is the equivalent of not building your own geolocation system for a bank? I'm sure you've all heard of the not invented here syndrome. Of course you have. How many banks out there are doing blockchain experiments? All of them. How many are building their own blockchain? All of them. Why is that? Because that's how they know how to operate. And let's take a moment. If we want to do business with them, we need to speak in a language they understand. Here we are talking about interconnectedness, about accepting that certain things are not value additive, about accepting that you will do business by building dependency into your business model. It's not a technical challenge. It's a human one, and it's a business one. So 2 things to park, because we will come back to them. 1, sure, Bobby in the basement knows how to cut an API. But Malcolm on the 3rd floor doesn't know how to price it, and doesn't know how to price an API without driving his entire business out of business. Because most of the businesses that we're looking at, if you leave retail banking out of it, make money through reporting. That's their output. They do a little bit of activity and a hell of a lot of reporting. You stick an API in, you've stopped doing said reporting. You have exposed your data sets before they've been humanly intervened with, and you have created dependencies with a whole host of people along the chain. Now you have to share a much smaller pie with all of these people who now know how much or how little you are doing and who don't need your reports anymore. So that dependency is not a technical challenge. It's a human one, and it is a value chain one. You have organizations that need to make money. That's how they're set up. That's how they measure their success. That's how they pay interest on your savings, if you have any. And that's how quarter on quarter they justify investment to their shareholders and their board. So if we are going into those banks to explain what the revolution looks like, these are the questions we need to answer. And I call the APIs the silent revolution, because quite a lot of the banks housed in this building either have an API strategy or have already started exposing services via APIs, but haven't figured out how to price them, haven't figured out how to wrap organizational relationships around them, and haven't figured out how to manage Bobby, who sits in the basement and is the new geek and won't be putting up with the same sort of behaviors we were putting up with 20 years ago. So challenge number 1, what does dependency look like in the boardroom? Challenge number 2, for those of you who work in banks, with banks, for banks, or share space with banks, you will have seen MIS reports. Have you ever seen MIS reports? They tend to have an orange pie chart on them with some garish green graphics. And what they do is they give some complex and stale data to people who are experts and cast an expert eye on that stale data and confirm that all is well with the world, or at least all was well until last week when that data was pulled. That is antiquated and so 90s, and we all dismiss it. But is it? And again, I'm not going to talk about the technology that allows us to have real-time data, because it's here. In fact, all the guys in this building have technology and technologists that allow them to manipulate real-time operational data, transactional data, and be smarter with it. What they don't have is humans and organizational structures that know how to do that. So, the ninja over there is uncomfortable with knowing and comfortable with learning. Such an obvious thing, almost sounds like a truism, but actually, if you cast your mind back to every single banker you've worked with, they have spent a very long time learning stuff. From obscure acronyms to the conventions of the market, from the way their own organization approaches certain securities to the legacy infrastructure that you needed to be a wizard at in order to get from A to B. Knowledge was what got you promoted. Knowledge was what got you listened to. Knowledge was what got you to the chair where the garish chart was put in front of you. Knowledge was important. And now we're saying, knowledge. Yeah, knowledge is important, but learning is more important. Learning is important because the technologies we use change at a breakneck speed. Learning is important because we're actually absorbing models and engagement structures from every industry imaginable. Learning is important because when you look at things at real time, if you focus on what you know, you will miss what you don't know, and wasn't that the point? Well, sure, but after 30, 40 years of doing something, we may not have the rightly equipped people transitioning from the garish pie chart to the real-time analytics. And that's not because they're not good at their jobs, it's because the job changed so quickly and we haven't taken them on that journey. So one, from knowledge to learning, it's not an easy thing. Two, I will go back to risk departments. I'm secretly becoming the champion of the compliance and risk function. Never thought that would happen to me. But we want organizations to run responsibly. And when you have 50,000 people, when you have 150,000 people, as a lot of these banks do, quite a lot of the day-to-day running of your business will be managed by a process that is often blind to humanity and seeks to ensure repeatability, to ensure that your granny's pension is safe. Fine. What does that look like? It means that when you introduce real-time analytics, a trader, a decision maker, doesn't actually have a legitimate way of making a decision on real-time data. So many years ago, we ran this experiment with a company that did real-time analytics on a number of data sets. And they also had this experimental piece that captured these really obscure news outlets in 50 languages, something insane. People much smarter than me had worked out how to pick up patterns that were building up before they became, front page news that Bloomberg would pick up on. So they ran this experiment and they had indications that a certain copper mine in Chile would flood about 5 hours before it happened. So they thought, this is it. This is our time to shine. We're running an experiment with a bunch of people. We have all these little prototypes running. These commodities traders have information at their fingertips that is exactly why they got us in for the experiment. It wasn't. Or rather it was, but they had no way of acting on it because the risk stage gates that structure the way certain decisions are allowed to be made is last week's technology and doesn't have a way of validating those decisions. So a very, very difficult set of conversations started in boardrooms across this city on when you can't guarantee that a trend will play itself out. What do you do? Because, of course, you'll have false alarms, and we haven't had this technology long enough to establish a standard, not that the industry is happy with, but that your regulator is happy with and your risk department is happy with. So we need to do three things, and the technology is the least of our worries. Having figured out how to price it and how to integrate it into our organizations, we need to teach our management how to learn new stuff and what questions to ask. Those of you who have worked in operations departments at any point in your careers, you will know that the head of the department is the person least comfortable with real-time analytics. Because they don't know what to do with it. They don't know what question to ask. And after 30 years of doing something, you're so institutionalized by your own knowledge that you don't know where to look for what you don't know. It's a human challenge. We have the technology. What we don't have is the organizational readiness around it. So far, so good? Any questions? The next thing we need to wrap our head around is how organizations work. And again, those of you who have worked in banks will be familiar with this. So banks are fully aware of the fact that their people will make mistakes. Humans make mistakes. So they have a series of processes to catch those mistakes, not to prevent them. You can't prevent mistakes. You can't make sure that Bobby's girlfriend doesn't upset him before he comes into the office. You can't make sure he doesn't have a hangover. We're humans. We will make mistakes. So what do? You put layers after Bobby. You put second layers of control, 4-eye checks. You put certain constraints into what the fields that Bobby has to fill out look like. You have 2 or 3 sign-offs. You have every conceivable layer, which usually looks like process and people. So if you don't trust your people, you add more people, which sounds counterintuitive, but it sort of works. And then, magically, the other thing you do is you put processes in place that allow you to call your clients and say, Bobby made a mistake. They're called recalls, and they're fully acceptable within the industry. Perversely, the industry is fully okay with people calling their clients and saying, we made a mistake. Can you reverse that $5 billion trade? But are not comfortable with that being on record. So there is the other issue we have to resolve, because quite a lot of what the technologies we're talking about have in common is that transparency. Can you fix an error? Sure. Will there be a record of that? Yeah. None of this will make people a better person. I was on a distributed ledger panel not so long ago, and somebody actually genuinely said, but smart contracts don't sound like they will make people more honest. Well, no. This is not meant to make you a better human, although possibly the freedom from mindless administration and the ability to go back and say, hold on a second, all this process takes us away from what we were trying to achieve, so let's realign to the purpose. All of that might actually free you up to become a better person, but it's not going to fix your intent. So when we're looking at creating that API connectivity between organizations, one of the biggest issues is the visibility. The fact that your dirty laundry will not only be seen, because it happens now, but there will be a record. You won't be able to expunge it. So all of a sudden, as Ronnie said, it gets philosophical. We started from, what university should I do a milk round at to hire kids who can cut APIs because my clients are asking for them, or the regulator is asking for them if you're a retail bank, to debating the mechanics of trust and discussing what transparency looks like and where it needs to stop. And I don't just mean data protection and confidentiality. I mean record keeping. If you look at everything from corporate and commercial banking all the way through to the depths of institutional banking, there is a collusion almost of, we will make mistakes, you will make mistakes. We will make sure that the record reflects our intent. So the laboratory almost extends between these two guys. Because they know each other, remember? They know each other. They know what the deal is. Well, now we're saying you will be in a dependency structure. You will be learning new stuff every day. You will not be able to amend the record, but you will be able to have recourse on your errors. But you're going to have to trust your people, particularly Bobby, remember, our new geek? And you will also need to figure out how much you need in order to actually do that. Because if your entire infrastructure entailed having a Bobby doing the work and 10,000 Bobbies checking on Bobby, trusting this API developer all of a sudden looks like a much leaner organization. And that is again a human problem. It's a human problem because a lot of people who are very good at their job will be rendered literally redundant. It's also a human problem because hierarchy in banks is a little bit feudal. How many have you got? The bigger your team, the more important you are. The bigger your budget, the bigger your clout. So we're going into these meetings, championing our new technology, asking people to devise a brand new risk infrastructure to champion a new acceptability paradigm. That's a tall ask. We're asking them to shrink their own empires, to allow their people to become redundant in very massive ways, and to strip themselves of the mantle of what made them special. We keep talking about the technology, but the technology is not the challenge. The challenge is a value chain one, and it captures every piece of that challenge. Value, in fact, becomes a very contested idea. And I'm going to leave you with 3 very quick things. Historically, banks have considered value-added work a very flexible term. Whatever it is the client needed and they did, be it by their systems or human intervention was meant to be value additive. And every step that was value additive was therefore value extracting, i.e. you got paid for it. What we're looking at now is a series of technologies led by the mighty API that mean the banks will do less. Forget whether it's valuable or not. They will just do less. Once you've built it, you will physically do less. So how do you justify charging? Now layer on top of that the fact that people are increasingly becoming reluctant to pay for banking services. So that business, it's something that is in the way of your life, be it commerce, transaction, or buying an ice cream. It's in the way and you don't want to pay for it. And they're doing less and less and less. So all of a sudden, the charging point of a business that was never meant to be a utility and was never meant to be charity becomes extremely contentious, and it becomes contentious in a stealth way. Because while they were busy talking about blockchain, they started building APIs, not knowing what they were doing to their economy, as we were saying earlier. The second thing is appearances. Remember, I mentioned the fluffy sense that the average banker thinks that empathy mapping is fluffy. The average banker didn't know what a UX developer was. They didn't know what UI was. And now we have entire businesses cornering their little bit of the market because they have a smoother interface, because the experience is amusing. I signed up for Mondo because I thought it was fun. There was a little man running with my card on the interface. You know how much time I had playing with that? I've never played with the HSBC app. And I'm a mature user. So all of a sudden, the things that were dismissed as fluffy drive the market. We don't know how to do that in this building. And as Ronnie said, it becomes a philosophical question, and a philosophical question that people are very uncomfortable with answering. In order to be a viable business in this future, the questions that bankers have to ask themselves are on ethics and aesthetics. Who are you? What are you for? What gives you a right to a livelihood? And can you make me, as your consumer, want it? At the heart of this revolution will be Bobby, the API developer. But Bobby's there and knows what he's doing, as are the data analytics guys, as are the technologists that can build the future. What isn't there is the human and organizational structure that currently represents the bank and that needs to either transform itself or cede its place to something that is ready to price dependency, to learn rather than know, and to allow for transparency to be part of the value chain. Thank you. Do you have time for questions?
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
Is there one question?
Very interesting talk. Any questions for Leda Glyptis? Yes, we have one. Okay, just.
We've been going through this revolution. I think it's on. Okay. We've been going through this revolution now for sort of 18 months, 2 years. We're not a bank, but we're not so far away. And I think what you've sort of hit right on the head there is that the revolution has come from the bottom up, not from the top down. So from the organizations that you've dealt with, how have you seen that the successful ones that have finally met in the middle somewhere have achieved that?
So success is a tricky one. It's a very, very good question, and I will give you a bit of a cop-out answer, but you'll see why. So the revolution has come from the ground up, but traction in banking never comes from the ground up. So the organizations that had the right people but by accident or sitting in an innovation center were slightly better placed to engage. But honestly, the couple of examples I have seen engaging meaningfully with this from a technical and architecture perspective are the ones that either had to because a client asked for it. So I used to run IT innovation for BNY Mellon upstairs. One of the biggest clients asked for APIs. Generically, I don't even know they knew fully what they were asking for. Our CTO was inspired. An entire architecture and infrastructure was rolled out, 10-year plan from the top because a client asked. Have they cracked how to transition to this new world where the entire custody business will not be producing reports? Not yet. It's in flight. I consider it a success, but the fat lady hasn't sung yet. The other organizations that I'm seeing in my current life succeeding are the ones who are taking PSD2. I promised I wouldn't talk about PSD2, but you made me. Are taking PSD2 as a business opportunity. And they're saying, okay, if I'm going to have to do this, and I'm going to have to pay for this, and I'm going to lose so much of my roadmap. Because fundamentally, I don't know how many of you are in retail banking, but you could say that largely retail banks become profitable after the second or third product, right? So you don't sell current accounts to become profitable mostly, with the exception of very, very few countries. So if you lose that sticky entry point in order to be compliant, all of a sudden you don't have to make a business case for the API economy anymore. You just have to rapidly create one. So the organizations who had the leadership to say, PSD2, folks, is a business opportunity. And we'll spend 10% more than the guys next door, but actually we will be able to have a client interface rather than just become dumb pipes. Again, fat lady hasn't sung. Fat lady wears a $ dress, by the way, because fundamentally until it becomes profitable, it isn't business viable. But those are the organizations I have seen engaging successfully. They don't treat it as a sideshow. They gear change for their entire infrastructure to transition to a new environment. Technically, they are fully prepared to change everything. There is a business driver there, but the clincher is the product folks. And they tend to be the last ones to come along because they were out there selling the stuff yesterday kind of thing. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speaker again. Thank you, Leda.